At dawn, the sky over Europe was a cold, colorless sheet of steel, silent for a moment, just before the war awakened. Inside a B-17 Flying Fortress, 10 young men tightened their oxygen masks and checked the guns that might not save them. They had flown this route before. They knew the mathematics of survival, and those numbers were merciless. Every mile deeper into Germany meant fewer fighters beside them, fewer chances to come home. The truth was brutal. America's bombers were flying farther than any escort could reach, and the Luftwaffe knew it. High above the Reich, the air war over Europe had become a deadly equation, one the United States was losing. Crews called these missions suicide runs, yet they climbed into the cold and went anyway, trusting a doctrine already proven wrong. What they didn't know, not yet, was that a solution existed. A design hidden in filing cabinets and dismissed by the very system meant to protect them. A long-range escort fighter that could stay with them all the way to the target and back. A machine that would one day be called the P-51 Mustang, though few believed in it then. History often turns on a single decision. This story begins the moment those decisions failed until one airplane rewrote the sky. The story of the P-51 Mustang does not begin in an American war room, nor with a grand plan to reshape the air war over Europe. It begins in January 1940, in a quiet office in California, when the world was collapsing faster than anyone could react. France had already fallen. Britain was standing alone against the most powerful air force on Earth, and the Royal Air Force was desperate not for perfection, but for anything that could fly and fight. Sir Henry Self of the British Purchasing Commission came to North American Aviation with a simple request: build P-42s under license, nothing more. The United States was not yet in the war, and the company had never built a fighter plane. They produced trainers, solid machines, that taught pilots how not to die on their first solo flight. Fighters were another world entirely. High-altitude performance, cutting-edge aerodynamics, engines that could breathe thin air at 25,000 feet. But James Howard Kindleberger, president of North American Aviation, saw an opening. Instead of copying an aging aircraft, he promised something almost impossible. He claimed his team could design and build a brand new fighter faster, cleaner, more efficient than anything the Allies had within 120 days. From a blank sheet of paper to a flying prototype in 4 months. It sounded reckless, it sounded arrogant, and it sounded exactly like what the British needed. What Kindleberger did not reveal was that his chief designer, Edgar Schmood, had been waiting for this moment his entire life. Schmood, German-born, self-taught, a mechanic in the First World War, had spent years studying every mistake made by fighters of the era. The drag created by the P-40's radiator, the awkward balance of the P-39, the beautiful but difficult wings of the Spitfire. He believed a fighter should be more than parts bolted together. Every panel should reduce drag. Every surface should carry load. Nothing should be wasted, not even heat. From that philosophy came a radical idea: a laminar-flow wing to slice through the air with unprecedented efficiency. A radiator buried inside the fuselage that could generate a touch of thrust instead of drag. A structure built in 5 large sections so factories could assemble it like a machine, not a handcrafted sculpture. The work began immediately. Engineers slept in the factory. Calculations filled entire walls. The war in Europe worsened by the hour, and 5 men in California worked as if they alone could change its outcome. Remarkably, they came close. In September 1940, the prototype designated NA-73X rolled out of the hangar 18 days ahead of schedule. Even sitting still, it looked fast. But early Mustangs carried the Allison engine, a power plant that breathed well at low altitude but suffocated above 15,000 feet. Over the English Channel or the hedgerows of France, it was brilliant, fast, stable, efficient. Yet at bomber altitudes, where the air war over Europe would be decided, the Mustang struggled. It was a thoroughbred held back by its own lungs. And so, while Britain used it for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack, the United States looked elsewhere. The very fighter that would one day become the world's most important long-range escort fighter entered the war quietly, almost accidentally, still waiting for the engine and the vision that would unlock its destiny. When the first Mustangs arrived in the United States for testing, they should have caused a sensation. They were faster at low altitude than any American fighter in production, cleaner in design, and more efficient in nearly every measurable way. Instead, they sat on the ramp at Wright Field, ignored in the shadow of established programs. The Army Air Forces was already invested financially, politically, emotionally, in the P-47, the P-38, and the doctrine that bombers could defend themselves. In that rigid worldview, the P-51 Mustang was an outsider, a British-funded experiment with a foreign accent. Test pilots filed lukewarm reports, not because the aircraft was bad, but because their minds were already made up. They complained about cockpit layout, gun spacing, fuel plumbing details that sounded technical but masked a deeper truth. The institution simply didn't want a new fighter, and certainly not one designed with British money. It was the first sign of the bureaucratic blindness that would haunt the air war over Europe. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place: a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker. After flying an early Mustang in 1942, he recognized what Wright Field had missed. The airframe was brilliant, clean, stable, high-speed, long-legged. The only flaw was the Allison engine, which lacked the altitude performance needed for bomber escort. Harker proposed something bold: install the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same engine that powered Spitfires through the Battle of Britain. Rolls-Royce modified 5 Mustangs, and when the first Merlin-powered prototype took off, the transformation was overwhelming. Climb rate surged. Top speed jumped past 440 miles per hour. High-altitude performance, once the Mustang's greatest weakness, became its signature strength. For the first time, a fighter existed that could truly stay with bombers all the way to Germany and back. The world's first practical long-range escort fighter had just been born. But the U.S. Army Air Forces still wasn't listening. That's where Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hitchcock Jr. entered the story. Too old for combat flying, yet possessing a lifetime of experience and a network that reached the highest levels of power, Hitchcock became the Mustang's unlikely champion. He wrote letters, cornered generals at dinner, bypassed the chain of command, and pressed the case directly to General Hap Arnold and Assistant Secretary of War Robert Lovett. He argued that without a true escort fighter, the daylight bombing campaign would collapse, and with it, the entire Allied strategy in the West. The turning point came in late 1942, when bomber losses surged past anything the planners had imagined. Data from Europe made the truth undeniable. Without a fighter that could fly to the target and home again, the air war over Europe was unwinnable. Under pressure, Arnold finally gave the order. North American Aviation would produce the P-51B Mustang with a Packard-built Merlin engine. Assembly lines were expanded in California and replicated in Dallas. Factories retooled, engineers rewrote blueprints, converting every British measurement to American standards. Production challenges were enormous, delays costly, but momentum had shifted. The P-51 Mustang had finally been recognized for what it truly was: the aircraft that could escort bombers to the heart of Germany, challenge the Luftwaffe at its own altitude, and change the future of the war. Its moment of truth was approaching. By the winter of 1943, the skies above Germany had become a graveyard of aluminum. Black Thursday had shown the limits of courage and the brutal arithmetic of daylight bombing. At a loss rate above 9%, a bomber crew's chance of surviving a 25-mission tour hovered near impossible. Entire squadrons were disappearing over the Reich. Families back home received telegrams faster than the factories could build replacement aircraft. The air war over Europe was bleeding out. Then, the P-51 Mustang arrived. The first Merlin-powered Mustangs reached the 8th Air Force in November 1943. Pilots who had struggled in P-39 seconds and P-40 seconds found themselves in a machine that felt alive in their hands, climbing, accelerating, and turning with a confidence no American fighter had ever possessed. At 25,000 feet, where the Luftwaffe once held unquestioned dominance, the Mustang was just hitting its stride. The transformation was immediate. Losses in bomber formations began to fall as Mustangs stretched the protective bubble deeper across the continent. On the 4th of March 1944, 68 Mustangs escorted more than 600 bombers to Berlin, the first time American fighters had reached the German capital. Goering would later admit that seeing Mustangs over Berlin convinced him the war was lost. It was not hyperbole. It was recognition that Germany's last shield distance had vanished. What truly changed the air war over Europe was not just capability, but doctrine. Previous escort fighters flew tight with the bombers, waiting for attacks. Mustang squadrons did the opposite. They hunted. They swept ahead, dove behind, roamed to the flanks. Colonel Don Blakesley told his pilots, "Don't defend the bombers, destroy the enemy." It was a shift from survival to dominance, an offensive posture only a true long-range escort fighter could sustain. the Luftwaffe never recovered. German pilots reported that Mustangs seemed to be everywhere above them, behind them, even waiting at their airfields. Training programs collapsed under the pressure. Before the Mustang arrived, new pilots received nearly 200 hours of instruction. By mid-1944, many entered combat with fewer than 50 hours. They were boys flying into a storm they never had a chance to survive. Even Germany's technological gambles failed. The Me-262 jet was fast, revolutionary, and terrifying in the hands of an expert, but it was vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Mustang pilots quickly learned to circle jet bases, catching them at their weakest moments. No breakthrough came. No counter-strategy worked. The Mustang was relentless. But victory carried a human cost. Even the best pilots fell. Major George Preddy, one of America's most gifted aces, was killed by friendly fire on Christmas Day, 1944. And Thomas Hitchcock, the man who had saved the Mustang from obscurity, died in a crash while testing one, never seeing the triumph he helped create. By the summer of 1944, German skies belonged to the Allies. The Luftwaffe was not simply defeated, it was dismantled, its pilots lost, its training shattered, its airfields scorched. The P-51 Mustang had become the blade that cut the heart out of Germany's air defense, reshaping the course of the war. For the United States, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang was more than a tactical improvement. It was a strategic reckoning, a forced admission that an entire doctrine had been wrong. For years, American planners believed the flying fortress could protect itself through tight formations and defensive firepower. In theory, massed machine guns created overlapping zones of destruction. In reality, when waves of German fighters struck with cannon and coordinated tactics, the bombers were torn apart. The doctrine failed not because the crews lacked courage, but because the assumptions behind it were flawed. This failure exposed a deeper truth. Institutions can become blind to their own mistakes. At Wright Field, procurement officers dismissed the Mustang because it was funded by Britain. Others resisted anything that threatened existing programs. The result was tragic. The aircraft that could have protected bomber crews earlier, the only fighter capable of escorting them deep into Germany, sat unused for nearly 2 years. The cost was measured not in dollars, but in lives. The British saw what the Americans initially missed. They recognized the Mustang's potential, tested it aggressively, and pushed for the Merlin engine long before anyone in Washington took notice. Their insight and their urgency helped unlock the fighter that would change the air war over Europe. This collaboration became one of the great examples of Allied synergy. A German-born designer in an American factory building a plane the British first believed in. Globally, the Mustang reshaped how nations thought about air power. It proved that range, not just speed or firepower, was the decisive factor in air supremacy. A bomber was only as strong as the fighter that could stay beside it. A jet was only as lethal as the fuel that kept it aloft. And a war was only as winnable as the systems that allowed innovation to rise instead of suffocating under bureaucracy. Most importantly, the Mustang demonstrated the power of the long-range escort fighter as a strategic weapon. It did not merely protect bombers. It dismantled enemy training pipelines, crippled supply lines, and shattered air defenses across an entire continent. No other single aircraft had influenced the war's trajectory so directly. And yet, the lesson left behind was not one of triumph alone. It was a warning that the greatest threats to military victory are sometimes found not on the battlefield, but within the institutions meant to defend it. By the war's end, the P-51 Mustang had flown farther, fought harder, and shaped more outcomes than any fighter of its generation. It escorted bombers over Berlin, hunted jets over Germany, guarded B-29 seconds on 7-hour missions across the Pacific, and returned once more in Korea when newer aircraft lacked the endurance to stay with ground troops who needed them most. What began as an unwanted prototype had become the backbone of air power across 2 oceans. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The deeper truth lies in the men whose lives were changed by the Mustang, those who survived because it arrived, and those who did not because it came too late. At Kindelberger's funeral in 1962, former bomber pilots stood silently, not in uniform, not in formation, but as men who had witnessed what the right aircraft at the right time could mean. Some owed their lives to the Mustang. Others remembered the friends who never made it home because the system waited too long to embrace what the war demanded. In that sense, the air war over Europe offers a lesson far larger than any statistic. It shows how innovation can be slowed not by the enemy, but by hesitation, pride, and bureaucracy. It reminds us that a brilliant design is useless unless someone is willing to fight for it. And it proves that sometimes the most decisive victories are won long before takeoff in meetings, in memos, in arguments that shape the tools a nation brings to war. The Mustang's greatest legacy is not only that it was the finest long-range escort fighter of its time, or that it helped secure victory in the greatest conflict the world has ever seen. Its legacy is the warning it leaves behind, that progress must be protected, and that the cost of ignoring it can be counted in human lives. Today, when a restored P-51 Mustang rises into the air at an air show, it carries more than history. It carries the memory of young men staring down the cold edge of survival, and of the few outsiders who refuse to let a critical idea die in silence. It is a reminder that courage takes many forms, some in cockpits, some in boardrooms, all of them essential. And now, I'd like to hear from you. What do you believe is the most important lesson the Mustang teaches us about leadership, innovation, or the cost of war? Share your thoughts below. Our community values every perspective. Thank you for watching and for keeping these stories alive.